the Sumerian king list spans for over 241,000 years before the Great Flood, and these kings used to live for tens of thousands of years. It reminds us of the length of time that the Atlanteans used to live. Now, one out of the many incredible artifacts that have been recovered from sites in Iraq where flourishing Sumerian cities once stood, few have been more intriguing than the Sumerian king list, an ancient manuscript originally recorded in the Sumerian language listing kings of Sumer, the ancient part of southern Iraq, from Sumeria and neighboring dynasties, their supposed reign, lengths, and the location of the official kingship. And what makes this artifact so unique is the fact that the list blends apparently mythical pre-dynastic rulers with historical rulers who are known to have actually existed. The first fragment of this rare and unique text, a 4,000-year-old cuneiform tablet, was found in the early 1900s by German-American scholar Hermann Helprecht at the site of ancient Nippur, and was published in 1906. Since Helprecht's discovery, at least 18 other exemplars of the King's List have been found, most of them dating from the second half of the Isin dynasty, which was about 217 to 1794 BC. No two of these documents are identical. However, there is enough common material in all versions of the list to make it clear that they are derived from a single ideal account of the Sumerian history. Among all the examples of the Sumerian king list, the Weld-Blundell prism in the Ashmolean Museum cuneiform collection in Oxford presents the most extensive version as well as the most complete copy of the king list. The 8-inch high prism contains 4 sides with 2 columns on each side. It's believed that it originally had a wooden spindle going through its center so that it could be rotated and read on all 4 sides. It lists rulers from the antediluvian, that is before the flood, the antediluvian dynasties to the 14th ruler of the Isin dynasty, which was 1763 to 1753 BC. The list is of immense value because it reflects very old traditions while at the same time providing an important chronological framework relating to the different periods of kingship in Sumeria, and even demonstrates remarkable parallels to accounts in Genesis, the first book of the Holy Bible. The ancient civilization of Sumer, sometimes called Sumeria, is the site of the earliest known civilization, located in the southernmost part of Mesopotamia between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, in the area that later became Babylonia and is now southern Iraq from around Baghdad to the Persian Gulf. By the 3rd millennium BC, 3000 BC, Sumer was the site of at least 12 separate cities: Kish, Erech, Ur, we know Ur is where Abraham came from, Sipir, Akshak, Larak, Nippur, Adab, Uma, Lagash, Bad Tibira, and Larsa. Each of these states comprised a walled city and its surrounding villages and land, and each worshipped its own deity, whose temple was the central structure of the city. Political power originally belonged to the citizens, but as rivalry between the various city-states increased, each adopted the institution of kingship. The Sumerian king list records that 8 kings reigned before a great flood. After the flood, various city-states and their dynasties of kings temporarily gained power over the others. Sumer's mythical past. The Sumerian king list begins with the very origin of kingship, which is seen as a divine institution. Quote, "The kingship had descended from heaven," end quote. The rulers in the earliest dynasties are represented as reigning fantastically long periods. Quote, "After the kingship descended from the heavens, the kingship was in Eridug. In Eridug, Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. Al-Aljar ruled for 36,000 years. So 2 kings, they ruled for 64,800 years in total," end quote. Some of the rulers mentioned in the early lists, such as Etana, Lugal Banda, and Gilgamesh, are mythical or legendary figures whose heroic feats are subjects of a series of Sumerian Babylonian narrative compositions. The early list names 8 kings with a total of 241,200 years from the time when kingship descended from the heavens, quote unquote, to the time when the flood swept over the land, and once more the kingship was lowered from heaven after the flood. Interpretations of long reigns. The amazingly long tenure of the early kings has provoked many attempts at interpretation. At one extreme is the complete dismissal of the astronomically large figures as completely artificial, and the view that they are unworthy of serious consideration. At the other extreme is the belief that the numbers have a basis in reality, and that the early kings were indeed gods who were capable of living much longer than humans. In between the two extremes is the hypothesis that the figures represent relative power, triumph, or importance. For example, in ancient Egypt, the phrase, quote, he died age 110, unquote, refers to someone who lived a life of full, and who offered an important contribution to society. In the same way, the extremely long periods of reign of the early kings may represent how incredibly important they were perceived as being in the eyes of the people. This doesn't explain, however, why the periods of tenure later switched to realistic time periods. Related to this perspective is the belief that although the early kings are historically unattested, this does not preclude their possible correspondence with historical rulers who were later mythicized. Finally, some scholars have sought to explain the figures through a mathematical investigation and interpretation, for example, Harrison in 1993. Now, relation to Genesis, the first book of the Old Testament. Some scholars, Wood in 2003, have drawn attention to the fact that there are remarkable similarities between the Sumerian king list and accounts in Genesis. For example, in Genesis, the Genesis book tells the story of the Great Flood and Noah's efforts to save all the species of animals on earth from destruction. Likewise, in the Sumerian king list, there is the discussion of a great deluge. The flood swept over the earth, quote unquote. The Sumerian king list provides a list of 8 kings, some versions have 10, who reigned for long periods of time before the flood, ranging from 18,600 to 43,200 years. This is similar in Genesis 5, where the generations from creation to the flood are recorded. Interestingly, between Adam and Noah, there are 8 generations, just as there are 8 kings between the beginning of kingship and the flood in the Sumerian king list. After the flood, the king list records kings who ruled for much shorter periods of time. Thus, the Sumerian king list not only documents a great flood early in man's history, but it also reflects the same pattern of decreased longevity as found in the book of Genesis in the Holy Bible. Man had extremely long lifespans before the flood and much shorter lifespans after the flood. The Sumerian king list truly is a perplexing mystery. Why would the Sumerians combine mythical rulers with actual historic rulers in one document? Why are there so many similarities with Genesis? Why were ancient kings described as ruling for thousands of years? These are just some of the questions that still remain unanswered after more than a century of research. Addendum, Alexander Light. This is by Alexander Light, Humans Are Free. He says, in my opinion, it makes no sense for a species to tangle their true history with mythical stories and giving the facts that the Sumerians were extremely knowledgeable in so many different fields. It is obvious that they knew exactly what they were talking about, meaning that these events actually took place. One of the harder things to digest for some people is the extremely long lifespan of these heavenly kings, that is the Anunnaki. He says, in my opinion, these cargo cult gods had discovered, quote, the fountain of youth, unquote, meaning that they could not die from natural causes. Humans only start aging sometimes in their late 20s when their cells start dividing slower. Eventually, cells will stop dividing completely. But an ancient and technological advanced species such as the Anunnaki would have no problem genetically engineering their bodies so that they could live forever. For further references, you can check out the immortal Hela cells, as expected, science can go very far from there, and in my opinion, we are only centuries away from discovering immortality ourselves. Now, a couple of interesting features of the human bodies are the following. A fetus can grow back limbs while still in the womb, and our skeletons continue to develop until the age of 79. Hips widen and skulls increase in volume. So why do we start aging in our late 20s, and why can't we grow back limbs after we are born? Has our DNA been tampered with? Have we been genetically programmed to live shorter lives? This is by Ancient Origins and Alexander Light by April Holloway. Humans Are Free, and it's Creative Commons. If you'd like to join me on my Patreon account, you will hear content not covered by mainstream media. These riveting stories will be based on my research, and I will state my opinions and give my personal insight on diverse and controversial subjects and world events not covered by mainstream media, and not supported by YouTube guidelines. So whatever I have on my Patreon, most of those will not be on my YouTube channel. Please consider becoming a member today. More of the most significant and important videos will be on my Patreon channel. Your support helps me to continue my research and keeps this YouTube channel alive. And we depend on your support, your generous charity, because we help economically challenged families here in Athens, Greece, in Kapota, and we also help the young generation with university tuition and the community around our church. Thank you.